Thank you all for joining us for this continuing education webinar. I know that people will be joining as we're starting, but I want to make sure that we have as much time as possible. So I'm Aziza Belcher-Platt, the Education and Training Representative for APA's Division 49. And on behalf of Division 49 CE Committee and all of Division 49, we welcome you to our first CE webinar. I am really excited to introduce Dr. Nathaniel G. Wade. Dr. Wade received his PhD from Virginia Commonwealth University in 2003 and joined Iowa State that same year. He is a professor of psychology, the director of training for the counseling psychology program, and founding director of Network Community Counseling Services. He is a licensed psychologist in the state of Iowa and a certified group psychotherapist. Dr. Wade's research interests center on the process and outcomes of psychotherapy. Specifically, he has worked in the area of developing and testing interventions to promote forgiveness, understanding the impact of integrating religion and spirituality into psychotherapy, and exploring and developing interventions to reduce the stigma associated with seeking counseling. In all of these, he integrates his clinical specialty of group psychotherapy. He has published over 100 articles and book chapters. He is co-editor of 2 scholarly handbooks, and has received grant funding from federal and private granting agencies. So without further ado, Dr. Nathaniel Wade.
Thank you so much, Dr. Platt. I appreciate you organizing this for us and bringing it together so that we can present this CE opportunity and training opportunity on religion, spirituality, in group. So I'd love to get started. Now, Dr. Platt, I can't see the other people on my screen at this point. I don't know if that's something we can do real quick to do a quick, or is it?
No, unfortunately, we can't see people.
Okay, all right. Well, it's gonna be a little more formal then for everyone. And so as we get started, I'm gonna start my PowerPoint here in just a second, but I'd love to hear from folks. If they speak up, can I hear from them? I would love everybody just to be able to maybe introduce themselves real quick. Give us just maybe a city, state where you're coming from, and maybe what you do for your daytime job. So I'm coming to you all from Ames, Iowa. So home of the Iowa State Cyclones, and my lovely long, looks like a classroom office. So I'm just going to go down the line if we can, and then we'll know kind of who's going next. So I see Abby. It's just in alphabetical order by first name. So Abby, are you there?
It looks like people are putting information in the chat or in the Q&A.
Great. Awesome. That'd be great. Why don't we do it that way then? That'll work well. So if you could just put city, state, maybe what you do for your daytime job. That way we can interact through the chat a little bit while I get us started. That's a good way to go. All right. And then let me share the PowerPoint. We'll get that started. All right, and I will look forward to seeing the chats and introductions when I get a chance, most likely afterward. So today we're going to be talking about engaging religious and spiritual diversity in group therapy. We're going to talk about some opportunities and challenges with that. And so as far as an agenda, what I would like to do is discuss kind of group member religious or spiritual diversity with you. So we'll just kind of do an overview of that, think a little bit about religious spiritual diversity. We're going to move into then have a second section on discussing religious and spiritual group content and how to work with that therapeutically in a group setting. And then we'll move on to talking just basically some questions and answers, and we can do that through the chat as well. And Aziza will be helping me to get questions that you have. Along the way as we go though, if you have questions, about specific things that I'm talking about, just go ahead and put those in the chat or the Q&A section, and Aziza will let me know. She'll break in and I can just answer questions as we go on the fly. I think that'll be a lot, hopefully more relevant than waiting all till the end. We'll kind of engage it that way a bit. Okay, so to lay the groundwork for today, as we think about what we have available to us in the 90 minutes that we have together. The scope of this talk, obviously, there are some limitations to it. There's limitations, of course, to my experience and expertise. And so I just want to lay those out as a way, in a sense, like an informed consent. This is kind of what you can get from me and what we'll be focused on. And it certainly doesn't include all group modalities, all kinds of religious and spiritual experiences. So, but we will be focused on are more process-oriented psychotherapy groups. Now, I think that, the material that we'll talk about today can also be applied in other types of settings, group settings, but my expertise really comes from my experiences in process-oriented psychotherapy groups. I'm going to be focused on those groups that have mixed membership, so not sharing a specific religious or spiritual tradition, and that the group itself is not necessarily focused on religion, spirituality as a central theme. So as you can imagine, there would be potential differences if we were looking at a support group in a particular religious setting, where maybe it was focused on how spirituality might help one to deal with grief among people who all share the same religious tradition. So some of the things obviously would be different in those contexts. The work that I've done both clinically and research-wise in this area has really been more oriented this way. Process-oriented therapy groups, mixed membership that aren't necessarily focused on religion, spirituality as a theme. We'll also be limited in, some of the things that we can cover, again, given the time. So what the goals are then, kind of, as I think about what are the goals for today, I want to lay a little bit of a foundation for you in this area. Obviously, we can't cover everything, but I do want to give you a good foundational exposure to some of the concepts, ideas, and information in this area. Help to raise some awareness, perhaps, for many of you, that there will be an experience of new knowledge, new insight, maybe new ways of thinking about clients that you're already working with or groups that you might already be leading. And then hopefully motivating some interest. And so I had a graduate school advisor who, one of his main philosophies around teaching was, not information, inspiration is what he used to always say. And so I try and keep that in mind. And that's where this idea of motivating interest comes from, is I can't give you everything you need to go out and do this comprehensively in the time that we have. But maybe what I can do is raise some interest and motivate some interest so that reading, perhaps discussions with colleagues and other things become more of an interest for you. And then figuring out, okay, now how do I apply these in my group? All right, so to warm up, what I'd love for you to do is just take a minute and think on your own of a group, preferably a group client, if you can think of it, because it's more relevant to what we're talking about today. But if you haven't had a recent group that you can think of and you want to think about an individual client, I think it applies there as well. So I'm thinking of, I want you to think of a client in which religious and spiritual commitments were an important part of therapy. How was religion or spirituality relevant to the client and to their work with you specifically? What did you do with the client? What do you recall doing to specifically perhaps work with or integrate in their religious or spiritual commitments? And if anything, what do you wish you had done differently? And I just want to give you maybe 3 or 4 minutes to think about that. I'll just kind of pause, think through that, who that might be, try and bring back some memories of your work with them, and see if you can't answer a couple of these questions. If you have a place to jot that down on a computer, piece of paper, that'd be great. And then what I'd like to do is maybe come back to this and have you maybe share, a couple of you share maybe in the chat what you thought of and how that might play out. So while you did the warm up, or you're doing the warm up, it gave me a nice chance to read through the chat real quick and see where you all are coming from. It's, I have to be honest, you know, the virtual format is not at all my favorite. I'd much rather be in a room with you all and interacting. But what it does allow us to do is to bring people in from all over. So Atlanta, Georgia, and Oregon, and Iowa. It's really great to see people from different areas coming together today. All right, so hold those thoughts. And what I'd like to do is present some of the material that I have first, and then we'll come back to those examples that you thought of, and I'll maybe get a couple of you to share them in the chat with us, and we can interact with that a little bit. Okay, so where I want to go right now, this first section is talking a little bit about the religious or spiritual diversity among your group members. So religion is not always, but is often what we might think of as like an invisible identity. So you, just by, you know, casually looking at someone or casually talking to someone, you don't often know what religious background that they have, if any. And so one of the things that I kind of want to take a look at with you is, what do we know here in the US about people's religious or spiritual commitments and affiliations, and how might that play out in your groups? So one place to start for this would be just what does, you know, in terms of the US population, what do we look at in terms of religious affiliation? So here in the US, according to Pew research, the majority of folks in the US are Christian, affiliate with the Christian religion. So you can see there, that's the biggest piece of the pie at 70%. 23% are unaffiliated. That's the other biggest chunk there. And then other than Christian or unaffiliated, you have about 2% who are Jewish, 1% Muslim, Buddhist, and Hindu, and then 2% accounts for other religions. And there are hundreds of religions, from, you know, more traditional religions to new religious movements. There are a lot of those, certainly throughout the world, but for sure here in the US. So then another way to break that up, or to kind of drill down a little bit, is to take that 70% and look at, okay, well, what is the diversity within those who say that they affiliate with the Christian religion? Before I go into that, would point out that in the unaffiliated group, according to Pew, their more recent data shows that about 27% of that 23%, so, you know, about a quarter of that 23% of unaffiliated would say that they're actually spiritual folks. They're just not religious folks. And so as we talk about, and I use that term RS, or religion and spirituality, we also want to pay attention to that 23%. There's actually a pretty good chunk of them that would be still in this category, who consider themselves spiritual or having spiritual commitments, even though they're not affiliated with any religion. And that is a growing number over the last even 5 years. Has been an increase, but you can look at from the 80s and 90s, and that's a pretty dramatic increase of people who identify as spiritual but not religious. Okay, so then we take that 70% up. So at the top part there, you can see the 23% still remains of the unaffiliated group. The color just changed on it. And so, but of interest for us is around the pie, starting at 25%. That would be groups who identify with evangelical Protestantism. So they would say that they're evangelical Protestants. About 20% then would affiliate with Catholicism. 15% are mainline Protestant. 6% are historically Black Protestant. And then it goes back into these. So then there's a Mormon or LDS, and Orthodox Christian would be part that would make up the, and Jehovah's Witness, that would also make up that full 70% who identify as Christian. So for those of you who know a little bit about those different religious traditions, there is obviously a core that would bring all those different folks back to kind of a historical Christ figure to some degree, but there's also significant differences in how LDS folks and Catholics and mainline Protestants and historically Black Protestants, how they would approach their religious commitments, how they would approach their worship, and even a dramatic amount of differences even among their beliefs. although they might still be all under kind of a broad umbrella called Christian. And so this also helps us within the US to think about, okay, so we can't just say, oh, well, I'm mostly going to treat Christians, so it's no big deal. I don't really need to think about it. This pie graph says to me, like, oh, I need to be aware of lots of different things, even within this broad realm of Christianity, let alone understanding what it's like to be unaffiliated but spiritual, or to be connected to some other religions that are not Christian. So, Aziza, I'm seeing some pictures show up here on the side. It's great. Hi,
Yeah.
everybody. I love it. Very cool. So that'll make some discussion a little, maybe easier a little later. Thanks for doing that. All right. So then as we think about religion and spirituality, of course, it's not just affiliation, because affiliation really ranges a lot. You could have someone who basically maybe went to synagogue as a kid and hasn't been in synagogue since they were 13, but would still identify with as Jewish. But what does that mean in terms of versus someone who goes to synagogue or temple, 3 times a week? I mean, those are very big differences too. So we want to think about, well, what about beliefs, or what about practices? And so in terms of beliefs, we know a little bit about that from some survey research as well, in a representative sample of people in the US. This was a little bit dated now, it's from 2014. But I think that my guess is the updated data would probably be pretty similar. Usually it stays pretty similar with a range in about 5 percentage points, 10 percentage points in some of these items, but stays pretty similar. So for example, folks who express a belief in either a God or a universal spirit, 83% of people in the US would endorse that. That's a pretty high percentage. 53%, and this one always shocks me, 53% would say that religion is very important to them. So that's on a Likert scale from not at all important to extremely important. And at least 53% are saying at least very important in terms of religion in their lives. 36% are going to attend religious services every week. So that's 36% of a representative sample of people in the US. So that's all folks. And all folks, of them, over a third are attending religious services every week. Now, if we break that down a little bit more specifically, we see that folks who identify as Jehovah's Witnesses, 85% of those folks are attending religious services every week. For Mormon or LDS, 77% are attending religious services every week. Evangelical Protestants, 58%. Historically Black Protestants, 53%. So as you think about that, we go back through these kind of beliefs and practices and beliefs. You think about over half of the US population would say that religion is very important to them. So think about now, your clients aren't necessarily a representative sample of the US. I understand that. And so obviously there are local differences that could vary this a whole lot, but all things being equal, 53, maybe half of your clients are going to have might report that religion is very important to them. And you think about in practices where, and historically, most psychotherapy practices don't particularly do much with religion in terms of assessment or intervention. So you think about in those kinds of settings, maybe half of the clients are saying that religion is very important to them. And maybe very few of them are actually sharing that. Again, get back to my point about religion often being an invisible identity. What does that look like for folks then who are in therapy but not talking about it, and working with therapists who maybe aren't asking about it? And then we put on the layer that we're talking about today, which is group. So now we're in a group setting. So now it's not just me and a trusted therapist, but it's me, a trusted therapist, hopefully, maybe 2 co-leaders, and the other folks in my group. How do I bring up religion, spirituality in that? How do I make those decisions? Becomes really interesting, particularly given the fact that in the US, you're going to catch many people who are attending services. It's an integral part of their life. They're saying it's very important to them, and many who believe in some form of God or universal spirit. So that's kind of where I'm thinking of the kind of the importance of this background. And so I think about, okay, so what are the implications of just these simple like survey data? Well, like I said, one is that many group members are probably going to be religious or spiritual, or even if they aren't currently, many of them will have had significant exposure to being religious. So, if you have a simple question on your intake paperwork that says, are you religious or spiritual, or, do you affiliate? And you might have a fair amount of people who say no, or not really. And yet maybe they've got a significant history with religion or spirituality. And from what we know from the religious and spiritual trauma literature, many people have really negative experiences that they bring to therapy related specifically to religion and spirituality. So again, we're talking about being aware of this, raising awareness for this as a potential issue, and then thinking about, okay, so then what do we want to do with that? So as we said, many people that you're working with are likely to hold religious or spiritual commitments that are important to them and to their daily functioning. And so as we think about group specifically, your group members, again, given the scope that I laid out in the opening about this being in a mixed group, not brought together for a specific religious or spiritual purpose, you can imagine that your group members are likely to differ on a range of these RS identities. So their affiliation, so what particular group might they affiliate with? But then, like I said, within that, you might have differences in terms of commitment or how important or salient that religion is to people, high to low, differences in beliefs. So just because someone claims to be LDS or Jewish or what, there's a wide range of beliefs even within affiliations. And then, of course, of expression. So the ways in which people express those things, not only in your group, but in their daily lives. So the next step I'd like to take with you all is to go maybe one step deeper into the data. So kind of at this first level, we can just look at these surveys. How do people affiliate? What do they believe? And that alone we see actually does have some implications for the work we do. But what I want to do is share with you about 2 or 3 studies that we've done in my lab over the years that are specifically related to religion and spirituality in therapy or counseling groups, and kind of walk through that with you, give you some exposure to that, and then we can see from there how that might inform the work that we do, particularly in a group setting. So one of the studies we did, we reached out to 9 different university counseling centers across the country. Actually, we reached out to a whole lot more than that, but 9 were the ones that responded to us. And we collected data from 164 group clients. So these are students at these universities that were in their university counseling centers in their group therapy and currently running. And so we just it was just a cross-sectional study. So we went in at a one-time period. We interviewed or surveyed with a questionnaire, not interviews, these group clients. They filled out questionnaires for us. And we asked questions relating to things like preferences for discussing different specific things related to religion, spirituality in their group. And so we asked them, do you have preferences for discussing any religious concerns that you have, or any spiritual concerns? And of our group of our sample, 164 group clients in these different university counseling centers, over half of them actually reported wanting to talk about or having a preference for being able to talk about their religious concerns. And then 3/4 of them said they have preferences for talking about their spiritual concerns. So again, I guess this is what keeps me fresh in doing research is, I feel like I should have the answers, and then I do the research and I'm like, oh my gosh, like I'm just always shocked by this stuff. Maybe I shouldn't be, I don't know, but I'm always shocked. So I would have never expected that the groups that, the kinds of groups that I've led and have supervised for years, over probably pretty close to 20 years, that many people would have the preference for talking about it. Again, these are not religious or spiritual schools or universities that we're interviewing here. These are places like the University of Delaware, Iowa State, Creighton University was one that was affiliated with Catholicism, but so there's a range there, but certainly not all religious schools. All right, so then we with this group, we also asked them, we collected data on different aspects of their experience and their background and things like that, and then we used that to predict their preferences to discuss religion. So we had, preferences to discuss religion was not a yes or no, it was kind of on that Likert scale. And then we actually predicted scores on that preference scale. And so the things that actually were significant predictors of the preference to discuss religion in group was group member religious commitment, as you would imagine. Now that one didn't surprise me. That one I expected, that those clients who had greater religious commitment had a stronger preference to discuss religion. Although I will make the comment in the open-ended, we had some open-ended items where they could just kind of respond and answer kind of text-based data that way. And we did find that kind of anecdotally, some of those folks who were very high on religious commitment, there was a minority of them that said, actually, I don't want to talk about these things. And we asked them, okay, well, why? Well, what is your reasoning? And many people reported feeling like either on the one hand, I want to go to more of like a expert, so my priest or rabbi, pastor to do those things. I don't really want to do that with a therapist. And then there were some who were kind of saying like, and the therapist doesn't feel like, I don't feel like they would want to talk about it or that they were really open. That's not kind of where I wanted to go with it. So there were certainly folks who were religiously committed, but were also like a little hesitant. But in general, what we found is that the more religious commitment that a member had, the more they wanted to talk about it, the more they preferred to talk about religion in their group. We also found that people who reported more religious struggles wanted to talk about it. And so that was another piece that open-ended data kind of showed us, is that some folks just simply said, I don't really have a preference to do this because I don't really have anything to talk about. Like it's just not kind of an issue. And this showed up in this data as well, where when we measured people's religious struggles, the more struggles they reported, the more they had a preference to talk about it. As you would imagine, they wanted to be able to talk through that as part of their mental health, as part of their personal development and growth. This one, I love this one. So we measured, what is the frequency with which religion has already been discussed in your group? And clients rated that from their own perception. This is how much I feel like religion has already come up. And this significantly predicted it. And I love this because this helps us to, this gives us some information about what we might do as therapists in group. So for clients who perceive that in their group, religion had already been discussed more, they were more likely to prefer talking about religion and spirituality. So not just about what the client brings, but it's also about what we do in the therapy. And so if we make this something that's open, something that's an opportunity for people to talk about, sometimes if we broach the subject as therapists, that can lay as we know, that can lay the norm that it's okay to talk about it. And that leads to client preferences. Okay, we also looked at spirituality. So we actually split out the preference, like I showed earlier, preference to discuss religion, which was just above 50%, and the preference to discuss spirituality, which was at 3/4 of our sample. And so we also predicted that preference. And so the same, member religious commitment, member religious struggles, the frequency with which religion had already been discussed in group, that also predicted the preference to discuss spirituality. In addition to that, group member spirituality, we had a different measure of religion, a different measure of spirituality, and that also predicted, uniquely predicted the preference to discuss spirituality. All right. If you have questions as we go along, just a reminder, just drop them in the chat, drop them in the Q&A, and Aziza can interrupt me and we can do a quick answer there as we go along.
Everyone now has the ability to unmute themselves and
awesome.
ask as well.
Great. I'd love that too. Kind of get you to be able to, speak up if you feel brave enough to do that. I would love it. Don't hesitate to interrupt me as we go along for clarity or to elaborate on something. this is your time, and want to make sure you're getting what you need from it. So yeah, feel free to interrupt me. Thanks. Okay, so then we did a different study where we focused on the group leaders. And so, and what I'll say too, I should have said this when I started with these studies, we have a lot more data in these studies. So if you're interested in what I'm reporting, like go and look at the articles. If you can't find the articles, send me an email. I'll send you the article in PDF. It's really easy to do. So please feel free to reach out for that, and we can do that. But what I'm trying to do is just distill down and hit a couple of the key points that I think are most relevant. Okay, so in this study, like I said, we looked at group therapists through the American Group Psychotherapy Association. And we had 242 group therapists respond. And this was an experienced group. Shoot, I should have looked at this beforehand. I think, if I remember correctly, it was like the average years of experience leading groups was maybe close to 20 years for this group. So it was a range. We had, from just a couple of years to some people had done group 40 or 50 years, but the average actually came out to be close to 20 years. So it was a pretty experienced group. And so, of course, we surveyed them about their attitudes, their preferences for working with religion and spirituality in their group settings. And what we found is that many religious and spiritual interventions were seen as appropriate by these therapists. And what we did to measure that is we came up and we generated a whole list of different ideas, different types of ways people might bring religion or spirituality into the therapy group, and had them rate each one individually. And many of these, and most of these, were seen as kind of appropriate on our scale. What we also found, though, is that we asked them not only, are these appropriate, but we asked them, do you use these? Do you do these interventions? And most of them actually reported that they don't use them very often at all. There were a few outliers, and I suspected that those folks were probably in religious settings, but kind of the average therapist did not use them very often. So give you just a couple examples here so you know kind of what we're talking about. But as I said, you can go back to the article itself to find the full list. But we asked them about bringing up the topic of spirituality. Is that appropriate to do in therapy? Do you do that very often? And so 3/4 of our therapists said, yeah, it's appropriate to bring up the topic of spirituality and talk about that in therapy. But less than 20% said that they do this fairly often. So again, we're going to see here in these specific items, the ways in which appropriateness certainly outstrips actual use of these. We asked them the same, bring up the topic of religion, and you're going to see here a reduction in that. So there is something that feels a little safer about talking about spirituality. Maybe it's more broad, maybe it's less specific to a certain group. And so then that feels maybe a little bit better for folks. So nonetheless, still about 61% said that it was appropriate to bring up the topic of religion, and 8% said that they do this very often. So you can see very few, very, very few, less than 10% of our therapist groups are bringing this up often in their work. We also asked them about, what do you think about asking group members about their religious beliefs? And a little bit less, only about 50% said that that's an appropriate thing to do. And 10% did this at least fairly often. Now, one caveat, I'm gonna take these out, just go with my computer speakers. One thing that is important to note here is that this was in a survey format, and we had this item in a list of other things. And what that did is it allowed for a lot of contextualization by the therapists themselves. And so, one therapist in a particular setting might say, no, it's not okay to ask group members about their religious beliefs because of XYZ that makes total sense in their given context. Perhaps folks are in a particular setting where religion is not supposed to be talked about. Or maybe they're thinking about a specific thing of like, the clients here were in the group setting, the client's talking about, their depression or their interpersonal styles. And it's not appropriate for me to like interject in about, well, tell me about your religious beliefs. Whereas other folks might be thinking about more broadly, like, is it ever okay to talk about religious beliefs? And if I put it into my questionnaire ahead of time, or I do it in the group screening, and they're thinking like, oh, okay, that would be appropriate. So we didn't really specify, and we couldn't in that context. And in some ways we didn't really want to. We wanted to leave it broad for folks. But I suspect that that's part of why you're getting a real mixed response on this one. And regardless of that, what I'm going to say is I totally think it's appropriate, and I would strongly encourage you to consider asking your clients and your group members about their religious beliefs. But how do you do that? In what ways do you do that? There certainly could be examples that we could think of that we all say, oh gosh, no, that is not appropriate. We're not drilling down trying to get like, well, what do you believe about the creation evolution debate? And what do you think about this and that? I mean, how is that helpful? Is that, we're not doing theology debates here. We're doing psychotherapy. And so again, it really does depend on how you think about or what you mean by asking group members about their religious beliefs. Okay, so let's go back real quick. I would love for maybe like 2 folks, if you're brave enough to maybe show us your video, unmute, and tell us a little bit about what you thought about here, what you recalled about that group or individual that had strong religious or spiritual commitments, and that was an important part of therapy. Just maybe 2 minutes, 3 minutes, give us a little case description. Anybody willing to do that for us? Well, this was scary, I guess. My apologies. Should have made it more accessible, perhaps. I wonder if, Aziza, are you sure they're able to unmute? Maybe.
It looks like Cheryl just unmuted.
Yes,
Okay.
I did, but I can't figure out how to turn on my camera, which is okay because I'm working from home this morning and don't have makeup on or anything like that. So
All right, Cheryl, that sounds good. Yeah, just go for it. We can hear you at least.
yeah. So I'm right now, I'm actually an intern finishing up my master's degree in clinical mental health counseling in December. But I
Great.
work at an agency that we define ourselves as a Christian mental health counseling organization. So it actually is on our intake form for the clients to disclose whether or not faith is important to them. And so every time I do an intake, I ask clients if their faith is integrating their faith into session is important to them, and then ask them and try to get a feel for how that looks, how they would maybe want to integrate that. So sometimes, it might just be as simple as saying something along the lines of, I wonder if there's anything in the Bible that talks about the situation that you're going through now, and then giving the client an opportunity to consider that for themselves and how that relates to their situation. Sometimes I'll pray with clients, and generally when I pray with clients, it's at the end of session. And what I almost always do in order to pray with clients and really integrate their faith into it is to almost like do a summary within the prayer, and then to also present before God. Most of the people that come in are identify with the Christian faith. So to present before God that this is what the goal is between now and next session, and to ask for his help and his presence and the Holy Spirit to speak to them and to bring them into a place of peace. And I think that that's just a real easy way to integrate faith into session, and also to leave it open for it always to be directed by the client, and to not really intervene or get any of my own personal thoughts and views into that faith perspective.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Cheryl.
I can go ahead. This is Abby. So I've worked group-wise mostly with adolescents, and something I've noticed, it says be a panelist, join as a panelist, or stay as an attendee. I don't know.
If you want to be seen, Abby.
Oh, sure.
Oh, now we lost you. Yay.
You're
can't-
muted, Abby.
Okay, am I seen and heard?
Yes.
Okay.
Good to see you. Welcome.
Good to see you too. What I was going to share was that in the environments I've worked on, they're not exclusively Christian. And so I think a lot of times I myself have noticed in group work and with groups that I've worked with or facilitated is there's an assumption that that's kind of off limits, and that even bringing it up could be harmful to someone. Like if a group member, I've actually talked with group members about this before, and they're like, oh, I don't want to offend someone, so I don't want to share what I believe. And so I think a big part about this that's good is like we might need to introduce or ask about it, because group members might have some assumptions about this being an area that's almost like kind of like going political or something, right?
That's right. Yes, it's such a good point. I'm so glad you brought that in. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in detail, but just to respond to you at this point, it's like, we think about norm building. So what norms are set up, and often we're trying to push back on a lot of like everyday norms anyway in group, right? So a lot of people have the norm of like, be polite, don't share my problems, be kind when someone should, don't share anger. We're always pushing those boundaries. We're always trying to say, let's get safe enough, and we want you to feel safe enough and trusting enough that you can tell those things. Like maybe you get pissed off at somebody in the group. We want to work that out. We want you to be able to share that here. And I think, like that, there's a similar process that can happen with religion and spirituality, to be able to set those norms of like, you can bring those in, but how do we bring them in? And I've had a group where I had to really work hard because I had a couple of people in the group that really wanted to debate. And so whenever it came up, they'd be, and I joked about it earlier, but we spent at least a whole session, if not multiple sessions, with them trying to fight about evolution and creation. And I'm like, this isn't what we're doing here, and so being able to like try and set those limits of like, in what ways is it helpful to talk about religion and spirituality, and in what ways is it not helpful? In a current group that I lead at our local hospital here, it seems like almost every month or two it comes up. The rule is, oh yeah, you can talk about religion in here, but don't try to change anybody's mind. I mean, they've just made it explicit. Oh, you could talk, and they've even included politics now. If you want to talk about politics, that's fine, but don't try to change my mind. We're not talking about like, but you share about what your feelings are, what your beliefs are, no problem. Like that's okay. And so now the group has gotten to a place where they kind of repeat these or recite these kind of norms or rules to each other around it. And I think it'd be really useful for us to do some of that, like you said, up front, maybe bringing that in and talking about it and finding ways to do that. So yeah, great. So good. Well, I hope that the rest of you can have some thoughts in mind about maybe a client or a group where you've some of these issues have come out, and hopefully that will continue to make this more relevant as we go through the next section. All right. So let's click back over here. All right. So this next section is kind of thinking about religious or spiritual content in group. So, what comes up? How do we bring it up? What do we do with it when it comes up? And so, again, just thinking about that goal for today of like laying a foundation of information and knowledge in this area, thinking through that. We'll just kind of start with some basic stuff about, research. This is just one example here, George et al. But lots of research that shows that religious involvement is related to better physiological and mental health and even longevity. There's this crazy, again, hard to believe research. It's not mine in this case. I'm just being skeptical of others now, I guess. But pretty consistent and strong research that shows that people who attend religious services, even after controlling for things like smoking, disability, things like that, they live longer. End sentence. The mortality rate is actually greater among folks who are not religiously involved. Now, I have some questions about in my head. Part of my skepticism goes to like, okay, and what impact is it to be someone in a culture that is predominantly Christian, predominantly religious, to not be that? And what impact does that have to be, in a sense, someone who is on the margins of that particular world? And does that have, what kind of impact does that have? I don't know, or maybe there's some other explanation, but we do know from strong, really strong longitudinal data that there is a relationship. And so at least for those people who are religiously involved or spiritually engaged, these can be sources of strength that can really help people. So some of the suggestions on why people might be healthier is because of social support. Religious groups often, almost always, provide opportunities for social support that aren't available in other ways. That social support is often not even just like a place to go and hang out, but if you look at specifically, and probably most of you who are here today probably have personal experiences of this, there's something like deeper in a sense that religious groups often provide. So it's not just like, I have a group that I get together with and play soccer with, and they're like my buds and we have a great time, but we don't talk about like meaning, purpose. I'm not sharing like difficulties that I have in life. Whereas in a lot of religious groups, those social supports are not only built in to have fun and engage and get to know people and network, but it's also, there's opportunities to share these kind of deeper aspects of their lives, which I also think is very useful and helpful. Of course, coherence or meaning in people's lives is strong data that shows that people who rate themselves as more religious rate greater purpose in life. And then, of course, we know that religious groups very often promote healthy behaviors, fewer sexual partners, less risky sex, less substance use. There's even a lot of data that supports less suicidal thoughts and behaviors. And so these things certainly can add up to better physiological and mental health. Work that's gone back all the way to the 90s and before, religion and spirituality help people to cope with stress. So religion and spirituality, there's a lot of strong coping skills that come out of those beliefs, that come out of those experiences, and can help people cope with lots of different stressors. And quite honestly, religion, spirituality, those traditions really hold much of the accumulated wisdom of the world. Personally, I wouldn't say that they get everything right. And, you look at it, obviously the beliefs differ, so not everybody can be right. But there is much of the wisdom of humanity that is held within these religious and spiritual traditions. I mean, how long has psychotherapy been around after all? The priests and imams and rabbis of the world have been basically psychotherapists for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And so, there is much accumulated wisdom in those groups as well that again, as we're thinking about RS as a source of strength, can be tapped into potentially. I'll make the argument, could be, and maybe even should be tapped into to help those clients who have those commitments. We also know there's another side of the coin though, right? That with religion and spirituality, there can be additional burden that comes with that. Or another way of thinking about that is when religious or spiritual systems fail people and what impact that can have. And so you can think about social support systems and how that fails. I think of a kind of a personal story. When I was in high school and my parents separated and they had a really volatile and honestly an abusive relationship. My mom finally left my dad. The religious group that we were a part of at the time basically ostracized her for moving forward with the divorce. So as I look back on that as an adult and I think, ooh, that feels like a failure of the social support system from religion and spirituality. I mean, how do you take an abused woman and her kids and kick her out of her religious support system at the time she's making a strong and courageous decision to move away from an abuser? And that's not, that's not just my experience. I mean, that's a well-documented experience that happens within religious groups. So you can see the added isolation and rejection that comes when someone's going through a really difficult time. There's also the opportunity or the possibility for groupthink. And that's kind of the opposite. So one, you have the isolation, rejection, ostracism, but on the other hand, you might have this kind of coming together and groupthink is a social psych principle that talks about a strong norm, a super unhealthy norm where authority can't be questioned. People all get in line. People might hold some dissenting opinions, but would never discuss them, not only with the leader, but not with other people. And we know that although in general, groups tend to make better decisions, when groups get into groupthink, they make worse decisions than individuals would on their own. And of course, in the most extreme cases, I think one great example of groupthink would be, the Jonestown, Jim Jones's religious movement that ended in, over 900 people committing mass suicide back in the 70s. And there's a great documentary on that talks about, and the survivors talk about the role of groupthink in that system that failed them. Systems of meaning and coherence can fail. Behavior systems can fail. So these are the things that are kind of put in place that we talked about earlier of like, oh, these help, but there's this other side of the coin that might also create more problems for people, that might add more burden to people. So you think about how religion might create purpose for some people, but for others, it might restrict their ability to find meaning in their life. So by prescribed gender roles, perhaps, or specific kind of prescriptions about what they might do or what they might pursue in their lives in ways that might really restrict them. Behavior systems, again, of, very strict codes that, again, might create greater burdens for people. And so then one of the ways in which we might see this in group is a client who comes and is struggling with kind of the problems in living we see in group and the full range of those. And then they're carrying this extra burden put on them. So one of the things we found in some other research that I won't review today with you, but just to give you a sample of, is clients who have talked about, dealing with mental health concerns, but even more severe ones like psychosis, who their support system within a religious group told them, don't take your medication because your mental illness is really from the devil. And so you think about, not only am I dealing with bipolar disorder, for example, but now I've got a church group that really means a lot to me, telling me not to take my medication. And so this added pressure, this additional burden that's placed on them. And again, if we're not talking about religion and spirituality with their therapist, with our clients, we may not know that they're dealing and they're carrying these extra burdens in ways that actually we might be able to help them think through, to help them challenge, and to help them to ease that burden. So certainly there are other, prescribed behaviors that maybe would not be healthy as well. So, you can see some extreme forms of this in some religious movements. That one that just kind of is burned into my mind from research is from some other folks, not research that we did, but was reports of, religious discipline that really is nothing short of abuse. Kneeling on those metal grates, for, an 8-year-old child who did something wrong, and the punishment, kneel on the grates. And the explanation was, this is how you, purge the devil and the temptation from your life. And you spend an hour on kneeling on this grate, things like that. So there's certainly ways in which these systems can fail, or these systems can go wrong and hurt people. One of the things that Pargament talks about too is problems of kind of over or under control in coping. And so the over or under control, he basically talks about it. I think about like the serenity prayer for those of you who know, kind of out of the AA tradition, give me the serenity, the wisdom to know the difference between when I should do something and when I shouldn't, when I should accept something and let it be. And so what Pargament identified is there within religious groups, you do have some tendencies for problems of over control. And that's basically trying to control something that isn't controllable. A classic example of this that happened actually here in Iowa about 15, 20 years ago was an autistic boy on the autism spectrum disorder was kind of diagnosed by his priest or pastor as having been demon possessed. And so they did an exorcism with this boy during one of the church services. the men, really tried to hold him down with the idea that the demon was trying to, direct this boy to do really hurtful things. And the more they held him down, they eventually just suffocated him. And he died right during the service. And it's things like that it's just, we think like, oh no, like that can't happen. But that does happen. And that's not the only time. That's an example of like really trying to control a situation where it's like, you're not going to change this boy's autism spectrum disorder in that way. And then under control is kind of letting go and saying like, my higher power, God, other forms of deities, they'll take care of the problem. I don't need to do anything. And so just basically stepping back. And what Pargament talks about is when religion coping works well is when people engage their religious belief systems and support systems, and then are kind of collaborative with the divine, I think is one of his terms that he uses for one of the ways in which folks can cope. And so it's, yes, the divine is helping me and I'm doing something. And those kind of working together tends to work, as you would imagine, best. Okay, so again, questions about any of that stuff, let me know. Just flick your, unmute, jump in, or put it in the chat. And at this point, what I'd like to do is kind of, shift gears unless there are questions. So I'll just pause for a minute to see if there's any questions about what we've talked about so far, or comments. And then we're gonna jump into kind of a new application of some of this work, or new implications. Take a little sip of water.
I don't have a question, but I do want to say, I love that collaborative with the divine. There is a quote that I love that says, pray to God and roll away from the rocks.
That's a good one. I love it. Yeah, that reminds me of that the anecdote or joke of the man who was in his house and the floodwaters started coming up and prayed to God. You know that one? Eventually he ends up on his roof. He ends up drowning. He goes and he talks to God. He's like, well, but I prayed and God said, yeah, but I sent you a boat 3 different times and you didn't get in.
Right.
Like, yeah, exactly. What do we do? And how do we, and it's just that serenity prayer, just really, I think there's just so much wisdom in that of like, help me to understand the difference. There are times when I really need to like buckle down and get something done. And sometimes I need to just step back and kind of accept and take on that more of acceptance mode. But man, knowing the difference in those cases can be really tough. That's where the real wisdom is. So yeah, great. Thanks, Aziza. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about how racial religious and spiritual microaggressions come into the conversation here. So this is important in individual therapy as well, because we might be the ones, committing a microaggression against our clients and not even knowing it. Certainly we can be the ones in group to do it as well. And so we want to be aware of that. But in group, the extra added thing is what happens when you have group members who are committing microaggressions against other group members. And so there's kind of a little less, let's just say there's more opportunities for these things to happen. And so being aware of them, I think in group is even more important. And so we'll start just with a definition of microaggression. According to Sue, this is a brief, sometimes subtle or implied slights against or denigration of people based on membership in a particular group. It really, this work, as many of you know, grew out of mostly racial or ethnic microaggressions, but has been expanded into lots of different areas, and microaggressions have certainly can occur for lots of different marginalized identities, and certainly can happen within religion and spirituality. So if we think about religion and spiritual microaggressions, these would be exchanges that denigrate people based on membership in a religious or spiritual group, or religious or spiritual identity, or non-identity. So it could be against someone who is not affiliated with religion as well. And so the importance of this is paying attention to how this undercuts people's experiences in the group, how it hurts individuals. Again, this is important around this idea that often religion and spirituality is a invisible identity. And so things can be said in groups and hurtful to people who you may not even know that they hold that particular identity. And so it, I think, really becomes really important to pay attention to these. Because 70% of our country affiliates with kind of Christian, I think this article from Schlosser back in 2003 is a really useful one around Christian privilege. As someone who grew up Christian, it was really eye-opening to me reading through this and realizing like, oh yeah, like if I wasn't Christian, these things would create, would put me off. This could be potentially hurtful, or create an opportunity, or create an environment that doesn't feel particularly safe. And he does this by noting kind of the privileges that Christians hold in our country. And so I'll just direct you to that, to take a look at that. That's a really good article to help explore, again, do some of our own work, particularly for those of us who grew up Christian, to be able to do some of our own work about how have we been privileged, and how might we pay attention to the needs and the perspectives of our clients who have not been privileged in that way. Okay, so as we think about how might some of these microaggressions play out in group, I just came up with a couple of examples. One of the ways that I find from the microaggression literature that's so helpful is just kind of laying out like, what is the statement? And then what's the implied kind of message that people often hear in that message? And so I thought I'd do that for kind of some religious or spiritual microaggressions, to give you some ideas and to, again, lay a bit of a foundation in this area, kind of motivate some of your interest in thinking about these things and moving forward in paying attention to that in your groups and also in your individual work. So, this has been a term, the Merry Christmas thing has always been an issue. You have, I think just last year I saw a guy who had a shirt of, I believe in God. I say Merry Christmas and it's like, okay, so it's a cultural debate. It's a cultural, bit of a cultural war, skirmish point, if you will. But where this comes from a microaggression perspective, is by saying Merry Christmas, say to your group members during December, hey, Merry Christmas to everybody, whatever, to the group as a whole, what it sends this message of that Christianity is the norm, that we're all Christians here, and that if you're not, then somehow you're not fitting in right, you aren't one of us, and that maybe other religious holidays are not that welcome. And so, if you have a Christian client who just talked to you about like, oh yeah, I'm going to be celebrating Christmas, and you say, hey, Merry Christmas. That's not what I'm talking about, right? It's not that you can't ever say this term. It's about being thoughtful about how we say them and when we say them. So saying again to the whole group in that way, when we don't really talk about other holidays, or we don't wish people other holidays, happy holidays, then that I think that's when these microaggressions are potential to occur. And so thinking about, well, what is that implicit message for folks who that don't celebrate Christmas, for example? And again, this is just one small example, but you might think about other ways, other language that we use that might send specific implicit messages to people who don't hold that same identity. Another example might be one group member might share an interaction that they had with a Muslim neighbor, and then they might roll their eyes in group and say, oh, fundamentalists. Well, what does that send? I mean, of course, this client's telling a story. It's maybe important to them. Maybe it's related to the work they're doing in group in some way. Okay, fine. And what might it be sending, particularly to other people in the group? So Muslims take their religion too seriously. Muslims are terrorists, or Muslims are dangerous. And so again, very bad if you have a Muslim in the group, of course. How does that make that person, push away from the group? But even without a Muslim in the group, in what ways does that set certain norms and send certain hurtful behaviors? Another example, a group member says to another member, wait, you're an atheist, but you're such a moral person, right? So then what does that send? That sends this message that atheists are immoral or amoral people, that atheists can't follow a moral code, that they're bankrupt ethically and morally, even though maybe the person's thinking like, oh, no, I just complimented them. I said they're such a moral person, didn't I? Like, isn't that great? Like, no, we have to think about, okay, but what is this implied message that's underneath this? and be able to pay attention to that. So we get to the last part. How are we doing on time here? Ooh, we're good. Okay, I'm gonna try and move through this and make sure we leave some time for hopefully some thoughts and discussion afterwards. But what do we do now? Given some of this information, what happens in group? What should we think about? All right, so a couple of things I want to encourage you to do. I want to encourage you to think about religion and spirituality in your work, and think about, are you assessing for religion and spirituality within your clients? So Cheryl, you mentioned earlier, within a explicitly Christian practice, you have these questions built in, and that I think is really useful to know where are your clients coming from, and how do we think about that, especially as you advertise as a particular religious group. You're going to have people coming to you specifically because of that and wanting potentially to integrate their religious spirituality. But I think this is for all of us, regardless of whether we do this or kind of advertise in that way or not, is how do we think about the assessment for religious spirituality? And there's a whole lot, there's a lot of work on this. There's a chapter that I helped co-author about this in a book on religion, spirituality, and therapy. There's lots of other references that we could help you to find if you're curious about this, talking about all the different kinds of ways to assess, implicit versus explicit, on paper versus verbally, etc. But just encourage you to think, how do I assess for this? When do I look at it? What do I look at? Do I look at just affiliation? Am I asking for importance? Do I ever ask about religious or spiritual conflicts or troubles? And so to think about assessment. Another thing I want to encourage you to do is to engage the group in conversations about religion and spirituality. So I would encourage you to make it a priority to ask about it or follow up on something a client shares at some point. And so we did a case study back in 2014. I'm trying to tell you quick because I know with time we're short, but I really love this study because I learned so much from it. So in my clinic, network clinic, we mostly do group therapy. I had 2 therapists that were leading this group. I was supervising the group or co-supervising it. And the group was going great. They hardly had a miss for 6 months. The therapists were working, the reports back we were getting were like, this is great. The group's bonded, they're sharing, they're doing work. And then about 6 months in, we had a client who said, oh, you know what, I need to leave the group. It was surprising to the co-leaders, but okay, they have to leave. In the goodbye session, one of the main reasons the client said they were leaving is, I've been in this group for 6 months. We're working on all these like really powerful things, in our lives, personal, vulnerable things. And religion and spirituality does not feel safe in here. And it's that's my thing. That's super important to me. How can I talk about all these deep things and not talk about religion and spirituality? This group doesn't really feel like a good fit to me. And so I'm leaving. Okay, so at that point, unfortunately, it was too late. Like that person was gone and did leave. But because we were in a research clinic, we had videotaped all those sessions. So I had my research assistants go back because I was shocked. I was like, I know these group leaders. They're not saying that religion and spirituality isn't okay. Like, what happened? And so we went back and I had my research assistants go back and watch every single group session and record every time a group member or therapist talked about religion, spirituality, or anything related. I even said, hey, if somebody brings up death or somebody brings up meaning or purpose, and even if they don't talk about God, write it down, give me like a transcript of about like 2 or 3 minutes around that time. In those about 25, 26 sessions, only 10 sessions, I think it was like 10 or 12 sessions, something like that came up explicitly around kind of a religious spiritual issue. And almost every time the therapist didn't follow up on it. It wasn't that they explicitly ignored what the person was saying. It's that they made a choice in the content of what the person shared to not attend to the religion and spirituality. Now, in talking to them, I know it wasn't an explicit decision they made. They just made an explicit decision to go toward the feeling of it, or to go toward the interpersonal process part of it, or to ask them more about their spouse, instead of fleshing out or focusing on, at least at some point, some of the religion and spirituality aspects. And so it really fit to me. It makes so much sense that client by the end of 6 months was like, it's not safe. It's not appropriate to talk about The therapists aren't leading us there. Other people aren't talking about it. So really powerful example in my mind of, oh, I think all they had to do was just say, you mentioned your husband was sitting outside of the Methodist church every week because he wanted to support you, but he didn't like religion. This seems like something really important. You're attending church every week? Tell me about that. Or tell me about this tension between you and your husband around religion. How does that play out for you? Does that come in here? How does that play out for us? And just a simple invitation, I think, would have made the difference potentially for this client. So that's why I say, make a priority, follow up about it at some point. Again, I don't think it needs to be all the time. I don't think it needs to be even the major focus for groups that aren't specifically focused on religious spirituality. But I think, again, it's those ways we set the norms. And by not doing certain things, we're also setting norms. Okay, let's see how we're doing here. Okay, so I thought I'd come up with just some example questions for individual members. Just, again, I know for me, it's really useful to just think about like language, words, phrases, like what could I say? What should I say? And then however this feels for you or fits in your particular context, great. If you can take some of it and it's useful, excellent. If it's not, then leave it here on the PowerPoint. What are your experiences with religion, spirituality? I mean, just broad stuff, right? How similar are your current spiritual or religious beliefs from when when you were a child? Assessing, has there been change here? And for most people, they're not having the same religious or spiritual experiences that they had when they were 8 years old. We know there is a thing called religious development. So it's a safe question. Most likely people have changed. And if they haven't, that's probably diagnostic too. How have your religious or spiritual beliefs been affected by what the person's coming in to deal with? Your divorce, by your depression, by your experiences with suicidal ideation. How comfortable are you talking about spirituality and religion in this group? So starting to get a little bit more process oriented, bringing it into the room, into the here and now. You've kind of mentioned these things. I wonder, were you hesitant to share that with the group? How is it like to talk about that? Who do you think in this group would be most accepting of you talking about religion and spirituality? And then if you're really challenging, who do you think would be least accepting? Who would be most judgmental about your religion or spirituality in this group? Love those questions. Clients always hate them. What would make you feel more at ease to discuss religion and spirituality in this group? I love this as like a general kind of question. Hey, Jan just brought up like some religious stuff. It felt like there was some discomfort in the group. You weren't sure what to do. What would make us feel more at ease that we can talk about it? What would we need to do in here to be able to do that? Again, just using your skills, using the skills you have for so much other kinds of topics in group that you're already doing, and just bringing it into the religion and spirituality context. Some for the group, we might look at something like, I noticed when LaToya finished talking about the struggles they have with their religious beliefs, no one responded. What's the silence mean for us? Tapping into this limitation that people might have in speaking about these things. Spiritual religious topics have been implied in much of what you all have said today, but I noticed we haven't talked about them directly. What are the obstacles to talking about these concerns more directly in here? How would you all like to talk about religion and spirituality in this group? What hinders us from a more explicit discussions? So these are all along the same line. I love the support you all just gave Bill. I noticed though that no one responded to his sharing about his connection to God. That's one of the main things that's gotten him through this hard time. What's that bring up for each of you? Again, you're kind of paying attention in some of these statements to things that people have said. You're paying attention to what isn't being said. It's these things that you do in group already, attending to and making explicit the implicit. And then how do we think about what might we do with some of these microaggressions, and what might we, how might we limit that, those problems for folks in the group, particularly who would be impacted by them. So just a couple of general points, and this is just a starting point. There's much to do in this area. And fortunately, I can say in the last few years, there's been some really great work that's been developing in this area. And we still need a ton more, but at least now there is some places where you can go, some literature that's out there that you can kind of deepen your understanding and thoughts around these things. So, but here's just a couple of starting points. You know, the idea of calling in versus calling out. So, you know, the call out is, if you're not familiar with that, is, you know, it's like that sense of like, oh, gotcha, you know, you did something wrong, you said the wrong thing, boy, you just microaggressed, and, you know, we're going to reject you now. And the calling in is really more of this idea of like attending to what the person said, that, you know, this could be hurtful, that this isn't really appropriate in this setting, along that line, but being able to do it in a way that stays connected. And that's tough. I think that's tricky. So being able to communicate that conflict, in a sense, that disagreement, in a way though that communicates the deeper care, the deeper goal of trust and cohesion in our group. So being able to work with the clients perhaps to see both the intention of where they were coming from. Well, what? Yeah, he's an atheist, but I just said he's moral. Like, you know, I just meant to like compliment how moral he was. Yeah, that makes so much sense. I understand that. I can be empathic to that. And let's think about what potential impact that had despite your intention. So being able to understand and separate out that intention from the impact, and help the group member to hold that and to communicate perhaps with that person in the group. Being able to use or name your own experience of the interaction can be really useful to call in versus call out, to be able to say like, ooh, I was impacted by that. I felt that. I sensed that you were trying to say something positive, but in that I felt kind of like maybe put off that, oh, are we saying that atheists aren't moral? You know, and being able to talk about that and bring in kind of your own experience around the specific interaction, and use that perhaps as a stepping point for the group member who might have been hurt by what was said, to help them to also own up to like, yeah, this does hurt and I don't like this. And yeah, I rather than, oh, no, it's okay. I understand. I know you didn't mean it, which mostly is just, you know, hiding under the rug those stronger feelings. Again, another point would be to stay rooted in your values. So these could be therapeutic values, the things that you're trying to do therapeutically. These might be values around equity and inclusion, but staying rooted in those and staying true to those. So, you know, why do we address microaggressions? Why? I mean, I have kind of an answer myself, but what would be your answer for you? Why should you, or why might you address microaggressions in your group? How that answer can guide then what you do, because those values can help you to be clear about your goal, where you're trying to get. So for me, one of the major things is, you know, I think it around equity, that folks who are often marginalized have to deal with this all the time. And so they're experiencing these microaggressions at work, you know, in the grocery store, by watching TV, by, you know, and that the impact of that, you know, over time can be so destructive for groups and for individuals. And so for me, my value is I want to create a corrective emotional experience for people. And so can I do that in terms of microaggressions? Well, I hope so, and I'd love to. And so how do I do that? Well, then I have to be involved in setting norms and in intervening and setting boundaries and helping people to talk through these things. And so that's part for me where it comes from. But what about for you? What are your values? What are you hoping to achieve? And what do you hold as important? And my guess is that those values would also support addressing microaggressions and trying to limit those in your groups. And then, you know, for me, this is a big one, you know, managing my own nervous system around these issues. As someone who grew up with lots of privilege and lots of kind of protection around having to have these conversations, whether it's about religious diversity or other forms of diversity, I'm not well practiced in it. And so I wasn't trained to talk and think about these things. When these things came up, my family and friends, we either made inappropriate jokes about them, or we hushed and, oh, no, you shouldn't talk about that. We don't see color. We don't see differences. And so, you know, in a lot of ways, personally, I've got an underdeveloped ability to talk about some of these things. So that's me. I need to address that. And that shows up in my nervous system, So I know when my nervous system goes off, that's something I'm not feeling comfortable about. That's not something I'm feeling competent and confident and skilled in. And so, well, what does that mean? Well, that means I got to do my work. That means I've got to figure these things out. Things that have worked well for me is talking to colleagues who I trust, who I know will push me, telling them some of the ways I've misstepped and getting feedback from them of like, oh yeah, you did misstep there. And here's how, and here's why, and here's what you might consider doing. Or when I do misstep, I've gone to colleagues and I've said, oh, I think, I want to go back and I want to do this and do that. And I've got a lot of feedback like, don't do that. Like, that is not going to be helpful. This will be helpful. Try this instead. Let's think through that process. And then, some of the stuff that I've tried to implement more recently is to really own my defensiveness and not cut that off so much. So when I feel that, I'm getting better at recognizing like, oh, I'm feeling defensive, and then just bringing that into my statements with my clients or with my students or with others who I'm interacting with is like, oof, I'm feeling that defensiveness and I don't want that to come across like I don't care or that I think that you're wrong. I'm feeling it right now and I want to manage that. And I really want to respond and interact with you. And I do thank you for bringing this up, even though I'm probably feeling and coming across to you a little, defensive about this. And that has been helpful as well. So another launching point for y'all, for those of you who want to do a little bit more on this around group, would be to think about, in thinking about microaggressions in group, would be this article by Noelle LaForge and colleagues in 2020 about training therapists to deal with microaggressions in group. And I think you can benefit a lot from that and other resources that have come out recently. Okay, how'd I do? Whew, we got 7 or 8 minutes.
You did fantastic. So people are free to unmute and ask questions, make comments. I see that Jeannie or Janine, I don't know if I'm mispronouncing that, put a comment in the chat. So I want to invite you to share it if you feel like it.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. I was just, when you were talking about leaders not following up on comments that the group members were making about their religious or spiritual beliefs and practices, I could just relate to that in a number of moments in group, especially here in Portland, Oregon, where I was saying in the chat that group, in social circles, people don't really talk about religion a lot, not just in group, but in general. And so, it was one of the reasons I wanted to come to this training, was to get better at, or a little bit more comfortable explicitly following up on those moments. So I really appreciated your example questions. Thank you. Yeah,
thanks, Jeannie. It's a really good point. Again, back to also that point about context, so the context that you're in, you're going to have to deal with it maybe in a different way than someone who might be in a context that's overtly religious and might have 1 or 2 clients who aren't. And so then, they're talking a lot about religion, and how do you make that accessible to everyone, those conversations accessible to everyone? Yeah, right. Great. Who else? Any other comments that you might have, things that stood out to you? All right, well, Aziza, if that's all the questions, comments, we can wrap it up there, I guess.
Well, I'd like to thank you, and I'd like to ask people to unmute if you're near your computer, just so that Dr. Wade can hear our applause. This was fantastic.
Thank you very much.
So really very much appreciate that. I'm going to put in the chat 2 links. One is for an assessment if you're interested in CE credit for this particular training. The other is for an evaluation. We would love your feedback on this training. And so I'm gonna just hit this. I see that there's some comments. Ashley, thank you so much. This is wonderful. So thank you again for taking your time out to give us this presentation. Thank you all for joining us. Please consider joining us on November 3rd for our next CE webinar with Michelle Ribeiro. And we're talking about navigating, examining and attending to social identities in group psychotherapy. So please have a wonderful rest of your day.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone.